Yeah, hi, I'm Anita, also known as AF Stewart, and I write a lot of folklore and mythology and legends, but on the darker side of those genres with horror and dark fantasy. And this one, my latest one, all nice and dark. Lots of folklore and legends in that book, and I also write a lot of short stories and flash fiction revolving around folklore.
Hi, I'm Leslie CONZATTI, and I am the author of Princess of Undersea, which is a retelling of The Little Mermaid. I've also had several short stories published in 3 different anthologies. Number 4 is on the way, coming in June. Very excited about that. I tend to do a lot of fairy tales and folklore, and just kind of twisting them up and kind of putting my own spin on it. I have a blog, which is where you can find most of the stuff that I write. Blog is called The Upstream Writer.
Hi, I'm Ceallaigh MacCath-Moran, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Folklore Department at Memorial University of Newfoundland. And I'm also a writer of science fiction and fantasy. And I don't have my latest collection to hold up because it's over on the shelf.
Hi, I am Courtney, aka CL Cannon. I am a fantasy and science fiction writer. I do a lot of things with fairy tales. I'm also a big lover of fairy tale retelling, so I'm a reader as well as a writer. I am doing a retelling of Sleeping Beauty that's going to come out in August. I also own Fiction Atlas Press. We've done an anthology on twisted fairy tales. We'll probably be doing some more stuff with that eventually also. So.
Hi everyone, I'm Rebekah Jonesy. I am an author of urban fantasy, and romance, which, let's face it, could also be another fantasy. And I write the series Mabsdoll. I also don't have the book; it's over there. And also, I'm the owner and co-owner and COO of Free Series Press, and we do a lot of fantasy in there as well.
Folklore is the expressive body of culture shared by a particular group of people. It encompasses the traditions common to that culture, subculture, or group. These include oral traditions such as tales, proverbs, and jokes. They include material culture ranging from traditional building styles to handmade toys common to the group. Folklore also includes customary lore, the forms and rituals of celebrations such as Christmas, weddings, folk dances, and initiation rites. Just as essential as the form, folklore also encompasses the transmission of artifacts from one region to another, from one generation to the next. The academic study of folklore is called folklore studies. Gee, imagine that. Or folkloristics. And it can be explored at undergraduate, graduate, and PhD levels.
I actually don't think that's a bad definition. Dan Benamo famously coined the definition that folklore is artistic communication in small groups. And that's essentially what you've read. You've talked about the various different kinds of folklore, and I think it's really important to note that all of those different kinds of folklore are folklore. Material culture can include foodways, it can include textiles, it can include folk art or painting. Folk music is a kind of folklore. And even contemporary cultures are creating folklore. Writing culture has its own folklore, its own customs. I would say, though, before I sort of relinquish the floor, that in talking about folklore and fairy tales, it's important to remember that fairy tales are a type of folklore. They're a subcategory. They're a type of narrative or folk narrative.
Yeah, it was spot on. I'd point out that there are times when it affects the way cities are built and houses are built and yards are built and all that other stuff too. Because like we have witch windows in the northern part of America, and in the southern part we have doorways, not doors usually, but doorways. The frames are painted blue, to keep witches out. So folklore comes in, and as I always like to say, stories change reality.
And it was kind of very technical and long and drawn out, I felt like, but it got the point across. So.
Hello, Wikipedia.
Yeah.
So that being said, I'm curious as to what drew you all to folklore. Is it something that you were inherently brought through as a child? Was it something that you all came across and kind of just gravitated towards? What brought you, and what made you want to tell stories within the context of this subculture and genre?
Yeah. I grew up in Nova Scotia.
That's a good reason.
I grew up with the stories.
I was read the stories as a child, and of course Disney probably had a big influence on a lot of the folklore that you first get into as a child, and then you go and you read the actual stories and you're horrified because they're so different from the Disney versions, and then you make up your own. They're just a little bit less horrifying sometimes, unless you're ANITA. She probably does some really horrifying stuff with hers because she's a horror writer. But.
Yeah, I use the original dark versions a lot of times.
Here, let me give it to you straight up.
Yeah, actually, the story I did for A Twist of Fate was one of actually the more milder stories I've written. So,
yeah, I definitely grew up with a lot of those fantasy stories and fairy tales, and just within arm's reach, like Chronicles of Narnia, Peter Pan, like all of the ones. And I would just read those over and over again and just love it every time, kind of thing. So. That's kind of where I started writing. It was where I got my first creative inspiration is from all those fairy tales.
I grew up in Kentucky, reading the folk tales, reading local folk tales, reading fae folk tales. My family is part basically Yiddish and Scottish, so a super fun combination of stories there. And like I said, I was in Kentucky, so I had some very selective folk tales too. Like Kentucky is the only place where you can find a haint, and there would be things like that. There would be little charms to keep haints away, and weird things that I didn't even know were weird until I moved out of state. Like you don't cross a bridge if it's got an animal skull on it. Things like that.
I love folklore because it resonates deeply with people, especially folk narratives. I'm fascinated by folk narrative and the way it moves people deeply, sometimes without even people realizing that it is. When we start writing with folklore, when we start writing with legends and myths and fairy tales, we touch deep resonances in people's own conceptualizations of story. And I've always loved folklore, but I went back to school to get my doctorate in it because I was interested in folk narrative.
The interesting thing that you've all kind of touched upon here in answering this question is there's something that has inherently always stuck with you about certain tales and certain things and little things that you've captured. And I'm curious, for your own writing purposes, because you are writing built-in stories, or you're writing based upon certain myths or certain folklores and the such, how careful are you to stay too close to the traditional model of what that lore is? Is there room for subversion, and is that the draw of it, is to kind of turn it on its head and make it a little different?
Well, I think there's room for subversion, because if you look at the folklore and the tales across different countries. And I mean, you've got in some cases you've got similar or almost identical tales, but they're slightly different here and they're slightly different there, and they evolve over time as well. I mean, like you take the Grimm brothers fairy tales, they started out very dark and now they've been Disneyfied. So yeah, I mean, folklore and fairy tales can just be adapted and twisted and done all sorts of different ways. So they're very easy to subvert. And that's the fun of them.
Is there that inherent starting point in which you know the original story that you keep?
Well, yeah, you have to start with at least the basic of the story because you know people are familiar with it. I mean, if you're going to do like a fairy tale retelling, you have to at least have some bare bones of the fairy tale to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're doing mythology or you're doing folklore or whatever, you have to have some elements that people would be familiar with, so you can take the bones and twist them into whatever you want. Like with my new series that's based on Arthurian legend, I'm starting with the characters people know and then doing all sorts of weird things with them. So
I don't quite stick true to all of them, but then I do too. I treat all of them. I have a blending of Egyptian mythology and Norse mythology and Welsh mythology and American mythology. All mine come together, and they all stick true to their origins, but I make them part of one story that evolves. You know, there's no reason why supernatural creatures wouldn't evolve the same way, you know, trees and humans do, after all. And, you know, why they wouldn't change, you know, when they're in a colder climate as opposed to a warmer climate. You know, they can be the same thing. So I keep it true enough so you know what they are and where they come from and why they come from that. But I also put in the fun little twist of, you know, this is the human retelling of it. This is what humans have explained to themselves to make sense of what they see. That doesn't mean it's the truth.
That's an interesting way to do it.
I also think it's important to think about why we're subverting the folk tales that we subvert. I've been looking at a child ballad, which I both love and hate. I have this love-hate relationship with this ballad. It's child number 10, the Twa Sisters, and it's been done by Lorena McKenna. It's been done by Old Blind Dog. It's been done by a whole bunch of people. It's a really popular ballad, English ballad. And in it, there are two sisters. One is fair and one is dark. And there's a knight that comes to court the two sisters at the same time. And he courts the dark sister with rings and gold, but he's really in love with the fair sister. And in the story, the dark sister becomes jealous of the fair sister and takes her for a walk along a seashore and drowns her. And then subsequently, minstrels come by in many of the versions and they see her dead body. Murder ballads are really dark. But anyway, they see her dead body and they make a heart from her breastbone. And then they go, yeah, it gets better.
As you do.
Like you do. And then they take this heart made from this woman's breastbone to the castle where the dark sister and the knight are celebrating their wedding feast. And then when they begin to play the harp, the only song the harp will play is, "My sister murdered me, my sister murdered me." Now, to subvert this, you got to think about, okay, why would one sister be jealous of her other sister? Why wouldn't she be angry at the knight for trying to court them both at the same time? Anyway, this guy's a jerk. At the time, this may have been a way of life. It may have been a morality. It may have been an idea that was common. Maybe ideas about women were that, you know, of course they would want the knight, so one would drown the other. But when we look at it from a modern perspective, why not have the sisters refuse his courtship? You know, what message would that send? So I like subversions that take a look at what the moral point of the story or the ballad or whatever was to begin with, and then say, wow, that just sucks for us now. Let's do something else.
Yeah, I think for me, it's not so much like subverting it as, you know, I like to take these fairy tales that I'm twisting and kind of pay homage to it kind of thing, and leave those things in there that kind of let you know what fairy tale it is, but at the same time putting my little twists. Like I like, finding the different variables. Like for example, in Princess of Undersea, instead of just completely giving over trading her voice so that she has to be silent as a human kind of thing, I was like, well, what if she could still speak, just her voice sounded different, and she might like be hard, it would make her difficult to understand, but she could still speak. And it's like, how does that change the story if she still has somewhat of a voice?
And also, what we're doing is nothing new. This is what has been done to these stories since, the first time it was made up or used as an explanation, 5, 6, 18,000 years ago. You can watch the progression of stories, all throughout time. And, they're always slightly changed to match that time, basically folklore. They take an old story and make it work so that it makes sense in that culture.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of things that you have to do, you have to kind of have the bare bones of the story, because you have to have that nostalgia kind of interaction with the audience. I was watching a really cool YouTube video last night on nostalgia and songs. If you've ever heard The Midnight City by, I think it's M98 or M48, I can't remember the exact band, but you when you listen to that song, it makes you feel really good. It makes you kind of, especially for probably like this generation, the millennials and people around my age, we go back to our childhood because it sounds like a song from the 80s, but yet it's different. And they talked about how that nostalgia kind of draws you into the song. And it's the same thing with these fairy tales. We're taking the things that we loved about them, and we're thinking, what if, and when you add in the what if, it gives the reader an excitement about, well, what are they going to change, and am I going to like it as good as I like the original story? And wow, if it happened this way, maybe they have ideas of their own of how it could have happened, and that what if factor kind of just makes it more fun to read. I've read so many retellings, especially of Peter Pan. Peter Pan retellings and Alice in Wonderland retellings are like my jam. I love them. I've read all kinds of them. And I love like turning good characters evil or giving characters different motivations. It's really exciting to just go down a different path, almost like a parallel universe. And another thing that you have to do when you're writing these things is you can't, pretty much just tell the same exact story because of copyright. Well, if you're using something that's Disney, like where I'm doing this Sleeping Beauty one, I cannot use some of the stuff that they've done from that, right? So I have to make up my own names, but still do certain things in the story that lets you know this is Sleeping Beauty, a Sleeping Beauty retelling, but it's not Disney's Sleeping Beauty retelling. So that's, some people have not read the original and they have no idea, about what names you can and can't use, what was actually her name and stuff like that. So there's a lot of research that goes into this, making sure that you've crossed all your T's and dotted your I's, and make sure you're not going to get sued for the stuff that you're writing too. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword.
Yep.
I think it's useful to remember too that the Brothers Grimm themselves sanitized the stories that they collected. They didn't give you the story as they collected it. Often they combined versions. They cut out pieces that were challenging for sensitive audiences. Often they tried to make the folk tales or the fairy tales palatable for children. So what we have from the Brothers Grimm is itself not, I wouldn't say, and I don't want to use the word accurate because, as Rebekah said, there are people share stories, and there are stories go through versioning, but they certainly aren't true to the people who contributed those tales, perhaps.
I'd be remiss because I have 5 incredible authors here, but I also have 5 females here, and oftentimes folklore has not exactly been kind to females, or it's been kind of dimensional. It's been one note in a lot of tellings, and the retellings help that a bit and such. And I know that ANITA has taken Alice and turned it on its head pretty well. But I'm just curious, when you're approaching your stories, how important that is for you to not, not fall into that trap and kind of give it a uniqueness that maybe I couldn't provide it, basically.
Well, I generally avoid the princessy type waiting for the prince to come stories, and a lot of my folklore tends to be the villain sort of point of view as well too. So yeah, and I mean in Visions and Nightmares, all 10 stories are from the point of view of a female protagonist. So they're definitely not the passive character that you find in a lot of the early folklore.
I agree. I kind of feel like anytime I want to write a character even if it's not a fairy tale retelling, if I want to write a character that's in that time setting, with more archaic time setting, that you kind of have to be aware of how women were treated at that time, but find a way to kind of weasel around it so you can make them a stronger character and they're not just over there waiting for the prince to save them. In my Sleeping Beauty retelling, instead of just laying down and being asleep through half of the story, she's actually going to fight the dark fairy in her dreams. There's a mage that's teaching her how to do, I guess, kind of like a dream projection or something like that, and I call it dream walking, but she's going to pretty much be fighting the fairy in her dreams, and he's kind of training her on how to do that. So
well, I kind of actually did for Princess of Undersea was that, like, the way that I kind of avoided the damsel and the waiting for the prince to come, or I want to be human because I fell in love with this human I just met. I kind of wanted to change that and explore, like, what if the reason that she wants to become human is not necessarily because she's in love with this guy, but that she sees this human that she saved as the kind of ticket to gain her father's ear, because he's the one who's committed to staging a war against the humans. And she's just like, but why? And he can't give her a straight answer. And so she wants to find out for herself, and she sees becoming human as a way to do that.
Mine is actually super easy just to avoid all that stuff, because I'm writing about characters who were originally strong characters. I'm writing about the queens of the Fae, Mab, Moira, and Maeve.
Nice.
They're queens, and they're supernatural, and they're super powerful, and they're as old as humanity. So, and my fairy princess, who is technically a fairy princess, like, she doesn't even really think of herself in those terms, because princess doesn't really mean anything to them. Yeah, that's a human thing.
What do you think is the biggest misconception people have about the story you're telling?
That it's easy to just twist the story, because there's so much research that you have to do, and there's so many different ways that it could go, and the characters, sometimes they'll just surprise you. So I'm what they call a discovery writer. I don't really plot that much. I mostly, things just kind of come to me and I write them down, and then I try to connect them all together. And sometimes you don't know what's going to happen. They're like, you will post a preview for something and you'll be like, will she choose this or will she choose that? And they're like, I don't know. Will you tell me which one she's going to choose? I'm like, I don't even know yet. So we'll see.
Well, I think maybe the biggest misconception is, that fairy tales are for kids.
Oh, that's a good one.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, what she said.
Yeah, because if you read any of the original stuff, they're not for kids. I mean, I had this little book as a kid of the Grimm's fairy tales, and it wasn't like the really, really dark stuff, but it was pretty much the original. And I mean, they had cannibalism in it. And it's like, yeah, that's not for children. They're eating babies. I loved it, but they were eating babies.
What she said, everything she said. So you're saying cannibalism isn't for kids?
No. The cannibalism was the children.
Or some of the punishments.
I mean, really, if you look at Hansel and Gretel, the witch is going to eat the kids.
Yep.
Fairy tales and folklore are an important part of our culture and who we are. And wanted to go around the horn and see how they've influenced you. Do you feel like you wouldn't be the writer you are without them, or do you feel like you discovered them because you're a writer and you've found that this can be an outlet for you?
Considering most of my books are based on mythology, legend, or folklore in some capacity, I probably wouldn't have any books.
Yeah, I'd have to say that the folklore and fairy tales are a huge influence on just me kind of realizing that writing was a way to explore the fact that anything is possible. The fact that, I can, in my imagination, anything can happen, and it makes sense, and I can make it make sense if I'm writing well, kind of thing. And like there is no problem that is unsolvable, because I can go through and I can pick it apart and I can really think deeply about it and work it out.
I'm going to approach this a little bit differently, because when I went back to school for my doctorate, I really started to learn the differences between different kinds of folk narratives. So I learned the difference between mythology and legends and tall tales and ballads and fairy tales, which are all folk narratives. They're all kinds of folklore. And what I've been trying to do over the last couple of years as I've been working on my newsletter is sort of tease out one from the other and talk about the differences in them in ways that writers can get hold of and say, okay, I'm going to write tall tales, and now I know how to do it, But before I went back to school, my fiction was really mostly far future, really imaginative stuff, sometimes prose poetry, And I've actually come home quite a bit to my own folkloric writing roots by going back to school. And the novel that I'm working on now is deeply folklorically rooted. In fact, I just finished a book on the djinn that was really interesting and really cool. So, I think I came at it backwards.
My take on it is it has shaped me in a lot of ways, because fairy tales, myths, all of that was part of my childhood. And when you're a child, your imagination is already growing so much. And it kind of led me down a path of imagining different scenarios, different stories. One of the first things I ever wrote was a reimagining of the end of Little Women. I wrote it down. It was terrible, but it was just something, I just wanted a different ending. And so I've always kind of started out reimagining things. And I also love that different folk tales and different fairy tales and mythologies from different cultures and different countries kind of help you get to know other people better. I know I had a really big interest in Indian culture. I had a big interest in Celtic culture, and that influenced what kind of music I listened to. And I started doing like British and Irish accents when I was a child, and I've actually got to do that professionally now for voice acting. And it just it kind of all just kind of mixes together to make who you eventually turn out to be, because it's things that you enjoy. When you're a kid, you're not judging people really. You're not judging yourself as much. You're not as your self-esteem is not as down as it is when you get to be an adult and you have to worry about what everybody else thinks.
Oh, I wouldn't be the same person I am now, let alone the same writer without the folklore and mythology. Because the main purpose of the original fairy tales was to teach lessons. And as soon as I realized that, I started looking at mythology and other folklore the same way. And that taught me more about people and culture and society and change and evolution and growth, and just how completely, absolutely, terribly, fantastically messed up the English language is than anything else has in my entire life.
I'm so glad we got this dark going. Yeah.
Yeah, there's tons of it.
The Wicked
My
Queen
husband
being
murdered
forced
me,
to
my
dance in
husband
hot
murdered
shoes
me.
until she dies.
Yeah, or rolled down the street in a barrel full of nails,
in a barrel full of glass. Yeah.
But yeah,
With wild
the
horses.
worst offender though is Hans Christian Andersen. I mean, the little match girl.
Oh gosh,
Oh, that one makes me cry so bad.
Jesus.
Yeah.